In 1973, a tragic mine collapse claimed the lives of 12 men. The community mourned, and the powerful families who owned the mine buried the incident with a lie. What they didn't know was that the earth never forgets. Decades later, a sealed chamber was discovered deep beneath the mine. It held a truth far more horrifying than a simple accident. Rusted chains fused into the rock, and a long-dormant evil that was about to be awakened. The debt of history was about to be paid, in blood and terror. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. Sheriff Franklin Cole stood at the perimeter of the Bluebird mine, the late October air carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The skeletal frame of the long-abandoned mine entrance loomed before him, a jagged maw in the hillside that had swallowed lives and secrets for decades. He watched as the heavy machinery, brought in for the scheduled demolition to make way for a new state highway, sat idle. The work had ground to a halt 2 days ago, with a discovery that had clawed its way out of the past, dragging with it a cold, hard truth that contradicted everything the town had believed for 50 years. Franklin, a man whose roots ran deep in these Appalachian hills, felt the weight of that truth in his bones. His own father had spent years in the belly of mines like this one, his lungs bearing the permanent scars of coal dust. Franklin had chosen a different path, law enforcement, but the mines and their history were an inescapable part of his heritage, a silent testament to the sacrifices and hardships of his community, particularly its black residents. The demolition crew, using advanced ground-penetrating radar to map the old, unstable tunnels before the heavy equipment moved in, had stumbled upon something unexpected. Deep beneath the known network of shafts, they found a chamber that was not on any of the old blueprints. It was deliberately sealed, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it remained hidden forever. Like it was never meant to be found, Sheriff, the foreman, a grizzled man named Dale, had remarked, his voice low with a mixture of awe and unease. Franklin had felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach then. Now, as the forensics team, their faces grim and focused, meticulously cleared the final debris from the breached chamber entrance, that feeling solidified into a cold certainty. This was not an accident waiting to be discovered. It was a secret that had finally exhaled its dark truth into the present. The temporary work lights cast harsh shadows within the small, cramped space. The air was stale and carried a faint, earthy odor, underscored by the unmistakable scent of aged decay. On the floor of the chamber lay the remnants of 12 men. Not the mangled remains of a collapse, as the official story from 1973 had claimed, but 12 skeletal figures, each still clad in the faded and tattered remnants of their work clothes. Their helmets, rusted and dented, lay scattered nearby. The initial shock was profound. The official record, a brittle file Franklin had reviewed with a growing sense of disbelief in the county archives, clearly stated that the 12 miners had been victims of a sudden and catastrophic tunnel collapse. Settlements had been paid to the grieving families. The town had mourned its loss, a tragic but accepted hazard of the dangerous profession. The lie, Franklin now realized with a sinking heart, had been comprehensive and brutally effective. But here, in this hidden, sealed space, there was no evidence of a cave-in. The chamber's rock walls were intact. There was no rubble, no twisted metal supports, nothing to suggest a sudden structural failure. The skeletons lay where they had fallen or been placed, a silent, horrifying testament to a different kind of demise. They had been entombed, deliberately sealed away from the world. Franklin recognized the style of the faded overalls and the design of the helmets. They were consistent with the equipment used at the Bluebird mine in the early 1970s. These were the lost miners: Thomas, Edward, Walter, Robert, and the others whose names were etched on a small, weather-beaten memorial outside the abandoned mine entrance, a memorial that now stood as a monument to a lie. All 12 were black men, part of a close-knit community within the larger, segregated town. Their disappearance had been a deep wound, particularly for their families, a wound that had never truly healed beneath the surface of accepted tragedy. Franklin's personal connection to this history was undeniable. He had grown up knowing the children and even some of the widows of these men. He had felt the unspoken sorrow that lingered in their homes, the quiet resignation that had become a part of their lives. His own father, a man of few words and even fewer complaints, had always steered clear of discussing the 1973 incident, a grim shadow in his past. Now, Franklin understood that silence. It wasn't acceptance, it was the weight of a truth too dangerous to speak. As the forensic team carefully documented the scene, Franklin felt a surge of resolve hardening his gaze. This wasn't just about uncovering a 50-year-old crime. It was about righting a historical wrong, about giving voice to the silenced, and about finally offering closure to families who had been living a lie for half a century. He issued clear instructions to the lead investigator. Every bone, every scrap of fabric, everything in this chamber is evidence. I want a full forensic analysis, DNA identification if possible, and a detailed report. This isn't a demolition site anymore. This is a crime scene, and we are going to treat it as such. He knew that reopening this old wound would be a painful process for the town. The truth would shatter the comfortable narrative that had been carefully constructed and maintained for decades. Powerful people, people whose families had benefited from that lie, would resist. But Franklin, as the first black sheriff in the county's history, felt an unwavering sense of duty. He owed it to these men, to their families, and to the long, often ignored history of his community. The cold case of 1973 had been exhumed, and Sheriff Franklin Cole intended to see justice done, no matter how deeply the truth had been buried. The past was no longer silent. It was demanding to be heard. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The news of the discovery at the Bluebird mine spread through the county like a brush fire, carried by whispers and a single hushed report on the local news channel. Sheriff Franklin Cole's phone had been ringing non-stop, from reporters, worried town elders, and the families of the vanished miners. But the call that truly broke through the noise was from a number he didn't recognize, and it brought a voice that was both analytical and entirely unexpected. Dr. Judith Vance, a historian and archaeologist specializing in Appalachian industrial labor, had been following the news reports with keen interest. Her academic focus was on the often overlooked history of industrial labor in the Appalachian region, with a particular emphasis on the experiences of black workers. The details emerging from the Bluebird mine, the sealed chamber, the skeletal remains of 12 black miners, and the contradiction of the official collapse narrative resonated deeply with her research. She saw in this tragedy not just a potential crime, but a crucial historical juncture, a place where the hidden layers of the past were finally being exposed. She arrived in town a few days later, her no-nonsense demeanor and focused gaze immediately setting her apart. She met with Sheriff Cole in his office, a space that felt suddenly too small under the weight of the unfolding mystery. Her initial approach was direct and professional, devoid of sentimentality. "Sheriff Cole," she began, extending a firm hand. "Thank you for meeting with me. My name is Judith Vance. I believe the situation at the Bluebird mine may have roots extending far beyond a simple industrial accident in 1973. Franklin, who had been fielding calls from anxious town officials and the wary descendants of the mine's original owners all morning, regarded her with a mixture of guarded curiosity and pragmatic assessment. He was a man of concrete evidence, and while he recognized the potential value of historical context, he was wary of academic speculation. "Dr. Vance," he replied, gesturing to a chair. "Right now, we're dealing with 12 sets of human remains in a sealed-off section of the mine. We're treating it as a homicide investigation. And that is precisely why historical context is crucial," Judith countered, her voice calm but emphatic. "The Bluebird mine's history is not the clean, straightforward narrative you might find in local records. My research, pieced together from census data, property deeds, oral histories I've collected over the years, and even some obscure legal documents, indicates that this very location was the site of an unrecorded, privately operated coal seam worked by enslaved individuals as early as the 1850s. The ownership lineage of the land can be traced back to families who are known to have held a significant number of enslaved people. This wasn't just a mine that employed black workers in the 20th century. It's a site steeped in the brutal history of forced labor. Franklin felt a familiar chill, one that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The idea that the very ground beneath their feet held such a dark and deliberately concealed history added a disturbing new dimension to the present-day tragedy. The chains the forensics team had mentioned, finding in the chamber now seemed less like an inexplicable anomaly and more like a haunting echo of a forgotten past. Judith elaborated on her research methods, explaining how she had spent years piecing together fragmented records and local folklore, often finding the most telling details in the margins of official documents or in the carefully guarded stories passed down through generations within the black community. Her work was driven by a commitment to unearthing the silenced histories of marginalized groups, and she saw the Bluebird Mine as a potent symbol of that erasure. The 1973 incident, she argued, could not be fully understood without acknowledging the historical context of racial exploitation and systemic injustice that permeated the very land. She presented Franklin with copies of some of her findings: faded census records listing unpaid laborers, property transfers that vaguely referenced assets being sold along with the land, and excerpts from late 19th century local accounts that hinted at a darker history associated with the area, often dismissed as mere superstition. She had already connected the Bluebird Mine's ownership lineage to the wealthy, powerful families in the county, the very same ones who were now calling to demand the demolition proceed. Franklin, a man who dealt in tangible evidence, was impressed. He knew the names of those families. Their influence in the town was a silent, accepted fact of life. They were the people who had controlled the jobs, the land, and the narrative for generations. Their power, he realized, wasn't just economic. It was rooted in the very ground beneath their feet. And that ground was soaked in a history of exploitation and violence. He agreed to let Dr. Vance consult on the case. "If what you're saying is true, Dr. Vance," Franklin said slowly, his gaze fixed on the skeletal remains in the photographs spread across his desk, "then these men in 1973 weren't just victims of a modern accident. They were working on a site that had already seen generations of suffering." Judith nodded, her expression serious. "Precisely, Sheriff. The 12 men who vanished weren't just miners. They were a continuation of a story this town has tried to bury for centuries. And the fact that they were all black men, working on a site with this kind of history, it's not a coincidence. It's a pattern." An unlikely partnership was forged: a seasoned sheriff grounded in the realities of law enforcement, and a driven historian determined to excavate the buried truths of the past. Together, they would navigate the present-day investigation and the long shadows of history, each bringing their unique skills and perspectives to unravel a conspiracy that spanned not just decades, but generations, all rooted in the dark soil beneath the Bluebird Mine. The ghosts of history were stirring, and they were demanding to be acknowledged. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. Sheriff Franklin Cole's next step was to delve deeper into the local lore surrounding the Bluebird Mine, and for that, he knew he needed to speak with Reverend Samuel Johnson. Reverend Johnson was an institution within the town's black community, the aging pastor of the small but resilient Mount Zion Baptist Church. His memory stretched back decades, and he was a repository of the oral histories, the whispered stories, and the collective memory of a community that had often been overlooked and marginalized. Franklin found the Reverend tending his small garden behind the church, his hands gnarled with age but still working the soil with a quiet determination. Reverend Johnson greeted him with a knowing glance, his eyes, though clouded with time, still sharp and perceptive. He had heard about the discovery at the mine, of course. In a town where news traveled more by word of mouth than by headlines, such a significant event could not remain secret for long. "Sheriff Cole," Reverend Johnson said, his voice a low, steady rumble, "I had a feeling you'd be coming to see an old man like me." He gestured towards the porch swing. "Come, sit a spell. Let's talk about things that some folks would rather keep in the dark." Franklin settled onto the swing, the aged wood groaning softly beneath his weight. "Reverend Dr. Vance, the historian. She's uncovered some compelling evidence suggesting the Bluebird Mine was built on a much older site, a place where enslaved people were forced to work. We found chains in that sealed chamber, chains that look like they're from that era. I need to know what you know. This is bigger than anyone thought." Reverend Johnson nodded slowly, his gaze distant, as if he were peering into the mists of time. "The land remembers, Sheriff. It holds the echoes of what has happened on it. And our people, we have long memories. Stories have been passed down, not written in books, but spoken in hushed tones, shared in kitchens late at night, warnings whispered from one generation to the next." "What kind of stories, Reverend?" Franklin pressed gently. "What did people know about the Bluebird Mine before 1973? "They knew it was a place of hard work, of danger," Reverend Johnson began, his voice taking on a somber tone. "But they also knew it was a place with a shadow. Some folks said the ground itself felt heavy there, like it was burdened. The old-timers, they talked about the first miners, the ones who weren't paid a dime, who weren't even considered people in the eyes of the law. They said their suffering soaked into the very coal, that their cries still echoed in the deeper seams." He paused, his gaze now meeting Franklin's directly. "The miners who died in 73, they knew these stories too. Many of them were the grandsons and great-grandsons of those first miners. They felt a connection to that history, a responsibility to remember it. They started asking questions, doing their own digging, so to speak. They wanted to understand the full story of the Bluebird Mine." "And what did they find?" Franklin asked, leaning forward. Reverend Johnson's expression grew troubled. "They found things that were meant to stay buried, Sheriff. They stirred up things that had been sleeping for a long time. My warning to you, Franklin, is not about ghosts or spirits. It's about the living. There are powerful families in this town, families whose wealth and influence are built on that very history of exploitation. They have gone to great lengths to keep those old stories quiet. They will not take kindly to having them dragged into the light now." He spoke of the Harrison family, whose name was synonymous with the Bluebird Mine, and other prominent families in the county whose fortunes had been intertwined with the mine's success for generations. He hinted at a network of influence and control that extended through local politics, businesses, and even the media. Their resistance to Franklin's investigation, he cautioned, would be fierce and potentially dangerous. "Those chains you found," Reverend Johnson continued, his voice dropping slightly, "they are a symbol, Franklin, a symbol of bondage, of lives controlled and broken for profit. The fact that they were found in that sealed chamber with those men, it tells a story of its own, a story someone desperately wanted to keep hidden." He did not speak of supernatural forces, but his words carried a weight of history and a deep understanding of the human capacity for cruelty and the enduring legacy of injustice. His warning was clear. Franklin was not just investigating a crime. He was challenging a deeply entrenched power structure that had thrived on the suppression of truth for generations. The real danger, Reverend Johnson implied, lay not in the dusty bones of the past, but in the still beating hearts of those who sought to protect its darkest secrets. Franklin left the church with the Reverend's words echoing in his mind, a stark reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often those with power and influence in the living world. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. Days turned into a week, and the meticulous work of the forensics team within the sealed chamber of the Bluebird Mine continued. Each fragment of bone, each scrap of fabric, each rusted piece of equipment was carefully documented cataloged, and removed for analysis. Sheriff Franklin Cole oversaw the process with a grim determination, knowing that these silent remnants held the key to a truth that had been deliberately buried. Dr. Judith Vance, meanwhile, continued her deep dive into the historical records, cross-referencing property deeds, mining company archives, what little remained, and the fragmented oral histories she had collected. She was building a compelling case that the Bluebird Mine's history was far more complex and sinister than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The consistent thread running through her research was the deliberate erasure of the mine's early years as a site of enslaved labor, a foundational injustice upon which the later tragedy seemed to have been built. Then came the discovery that sent a fresh wave of chilling realization through the investigation. As the forensics team carefully cleared the debris along the chamber walls, they unearthed them, heavy, rusted iron chains. These were not the lightweight chains used for modern mining equipment. These were thick, substantial links, the kind used for binding, for restraint. What was even more disturbing was how they were found. The chains were not lying loose on the floor. They were embedded in the very rock of the chamber walls, almost as if the stone had grown around them over time. The forensic analysts carefully worked to extract sections of the chains, their expressions a mixture of professional curiosity and profound unease. These were clearly artifacts of a much earlier era than the 1970s. Dr. Vance, examining photographs and fragments brought to her by the team, confirmed their age. These are consistent with the types of chains used for enslaved laborers in the 19th century, she stated, her voice hushed with a sense of historical horror. The weight, the design, it's unmistakable. Franklin felt the weight of Reverend Johnson's words settle heavily upon him. They knew about the chains. The Reverend's warning about the living, the powerful who sought to keep the past buried, now resonated with a sharper edge. Why were these chains, relics of slavery, fused into the walls of the chamber where the 12 miners had died in 1973? What connection did they have to the events of that year? The forensics team found no signs that the chains had been used to physically restrain the miners in 1973. They were too integrated into the walls, too ancient. Their presence was more symbolic, more suggestive of a history that had somehow become intertwined with the fate of these 12 men. Dr. Vance theorized that the miners, many of whom were descendants of people who had likely been subjected to such bondage, might have stumbled upon this chamber and the chains during their work. Perhaps they had been researching the mine's hidden history, seeking to understand the legacy of their ancestors. The discovery of such visceral evidence of that past could have led them to uncover other secrets, secrets that the mine's owners were desperate to keep hidden. The chains were a tangible link to the town's original sin, a brutal reminder of the foundation upon which the wealth and power of certain families had been built. Their presence in the sealed chamber suggested a deliberate act, a way of burying not just the bodies of the 12 men, but also this undeniable evidence of the mine's dark origins. Franklin's mind raced. The official story of a tunnel collapse now seemed even more flimsy and absurd. Why go to such lengths to seal off a section of the mine simply to cover up an accident? The presence of the chains pointed to a more calculated and sinister motive. Had the miners of 1973 discovered not just the chains, but the truth about the mine's past and perhaps other, more contemporary secrets that the owners were willing to kill to protect? The discovery of the chains was not just an archaeological find. It was a crucial piece of the puzzle, a horrifying link between the brutality of the 19th century and the tragedy of 1973. It underscored the idea that the Bluebird Mine was a place where the past was not just history, but a living, breathing force that had shaped the present in dark and unforgiving ways. The investigation was no longer just a cold case. It was an excavation of a town's long-buried conscience. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. As Sheriff Franklin Cole's investigation into the deaths of the 12 Bluebird miners deepened, and as the discovery of the centuries-old chains became public knowledge, a palpable shift occurred within the town. The initial shock and morbid curiosity began to give way to a simmering tension, a subtle but unmistakable undercurrent of resistance emanating from certain corners of the community. The descendants of the Bluebird Mine's original owners, families who still held considerable sway in the town's economic and political landscape, began to exert pressure. Mayor Harrison, whose family's name was inextricably linked to the mine's history, paid Franklin several increasingly strained visits to his office. The polite inquiries of the early days transformed into thinly veiled demands to expedite the investigation and proceed with the planned demolition. "Sheriff," Harrison said during one particularly tense encounter, his face flushed with barely suppressed anger, "this has gone on long enough. You're stirring up unnecessary trouble, reopening old wounds that should have been left to heal. The state highway project is on a tight schedule. We need to conclude this matter quickly and move forward." "Mayor," Franklin replied calmly, his gaze steady, 12 men died in that chamber. They weren't killed by a tunnel collapse. We found them sealed in, alongside evidence of the mine's history of forced labor. This isn't just about a highway schedule. It's about justice." The resistance wasn't limited to official channels. Franklin began to notice subtle but unsettling changes. He received anonymous, vaguely threatening phone calls late at night. His patrol car tires were slashed in the sheriff's department parking lot. Racist graffiti, crude and hateful, appeared on the walls of his office building overnight. The local newspaper, long known for its deference to the town's established families, published editorials questioning the validity of the investigation, subtly suggesting that Franklin was motivated by personal bias rather than a pursuit of truth. Dr. Judith Vance also became a target. Initially seen as an objective academic resource, she was now being portrayed in hushed conversations and online forums as an outsider, a troublemaker intent on stirring up the past for her own gain. Her tires were also slashed. She received anonymous, hateful emails filled with racist vitriol. The subtle sense of welcome she had initially felt from some members of the community began to dissipate, replaced by wary glances and hushed whispers. Reverend Samuel Johnson, a pillar of the black community and a respected figure throughout the town, also faced a backlash. His church was vandalized, a window broken, and a hateful symbol spray-painted on the front door. While the Reverend remained outwardly composed, Franklin could see the strain in his eyes, the weariness of a man who had witnessed such prejudice far too many times in his long life. "They don't want the truth to come out, Franklin," Reverend Johnson said quietly during one of their meetings. "They will do whatever they can to keep the past buried, even now." The pattern was clear. The powerful families, realizing that Franklin's investigation was uncovering not just a 50-year-old murder, but also their ancestors' involvement in a brutal system of exploitation, were mobilizing to shut it down. Their tactics were multifaceted, ranging from political pressure and intimidation to outright criminal acts. The hostility was not just a reaction to the present investigation. It was a continuation of the same systemic racism and suppression of truth that had allowed the original crime to be committed and concealed for so long. Franklin understood that he was treading on dangerous ground. He was challenging a deeply entrenched power structure, one that had historically operated with impunity. The resistance he and Dr. Vance were facing was a clear indication that they were getting closer to the truth, a truth that those in power were desperate to keep hidden. The pressure was mounting, but it only strengthened Franklin's resolve. He knew that backing down would be a betrayal of the 12 men who had died in that sealed chamber and a profound disservice to the community he had sworn to protect. The fight for justice was becoming increasingly perilous, but Franklin was determined to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The ghosts of the past were demanding to be heard, and Franklin Cole was determined to be their voice. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. As the external pressures on Sheriff Franklin Cole and Dr. Judith Vance intensified, their commitment to uncovering the truth behind the Bluebird Mine tragedy only solidified. They knew they were dealing with more than just a cold case. They were confronting a legacy of power and deceit that spanned generations. Dr. Vance's meticulous examination of the limited surviving records from the Bluebird mine yielded a significant breakthrough. Buried within a collection of seemingly innocuous financial ledgers, she discovered a series of coded entries dating from the weeks leading up to the miner's disappearance in October 1973. The code, a simple substitution cipher, took her days to crack, but the information it revealed was explosive. The entries detailed a clandestine operation occurring within the deepest levels of the Bluebird mine, specifically in the same area where the sealed chamber had been discovered. They referred to irregular disposal, hazardous materials, and nightly transport. Cross-referencing these entries with geological surveys of the mine, Dr. Vance realized that the miners had likely stumbled upon a site where the Bluebird Mine Company was illegally dumping industrial waste, highly toxic substances that posed a significant environmental and health risk. The timing of these coded entries was crucial. They coincided precisely with the period when the 12 miners had vanished. Dr. Vance's theory solidified. The miners hadn't been killed because they discovered the mine's history of enslaved labor. They had been silenced because they had uncovered a contemporary crime, one that could have had devastating legal and financial consequences for the mine owners. Franklin, working in tandem with Dr. Vance, focused on corroborating this new theory with any surviving eyewitness accounts or peripheral records from 1973. He interviewed retired mine workers, now elderly and reluctant to speak, but gradually pieced together fragmented stories of unusual activity around the mine in the weeks leading up to the collapse. Whispers of late-night truck traffic and strange smells emanating from the mine shafts began to surface, lending credence to Dr. Vance's findings. The official report from 1973, which Franklin had reread countless times, now appeared even more suspicious. The speed with which the catastrophic collapse had been determined, the limited investigation that had followed, and the swift settlements paid to the families all pointed to a deliberate effort to shut down any further scrutiny. The lie wasn't just about protecting a historical narrative. It was about concealing a serious, ongoing criminal operation. The discovery of the centuries-old chains in the sealed chamber now took on a new, darker significance. Perhaps the chamber, already a place of forgotten suffering, had been chosen as a clandestine burial site not just for the murdered miners, but also as a place to further conceal the historical evidence of the mine's brutal past, hoping that the two secrets would remain intertwined and undiscovered. Dr. Vance's further research into the Bluebird mine's corporate history revealed a period of significant financial instability in the early 1970s. The illegal dumping operation, she theorized, could have been a desperate attempt to cut costs and avoid proper disposal regulations, a move that would have been highly profitable but also incredibly reckless and illegal. The motive for murder was now chillingly clear. The 12 miners, by uncovering the illegal dumping, had become a direct threat to the mine owners' financial well-being and their freedom. Sealing them in that hidden chamber wasn't just a way to dispose of inconvenient witnesses. It was a calculated act of desperation to protect a much larger criminal enterprise. Franklin realized that the resistance they were facing from the town's powerful families was not just about protecting a tarnished family name. It was about safeguarding a legacy of criminal activity and the vast wealth derived from it. The stakes were far higher than he had initially imagined. He and Dr. Vance were not just digging up the past. They were unearthing a present-day conspiracy with deep and dangerous roots. The truth was a powerful weapon, but it was also making them targets. The unraveling of the 1973 cover-up had exposed a network of lies and criminal behavior that those in power would stop at nothing to protect. The fight for justice was no longer just about the dead. It was a battle for the soul of the town itself. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. Driven by Dr. Vance's revelations about the illegal dumping, and the increasingly hostile environment surrounding their investigation, Sheriff Franklin Cole felt a renewed urgency to find more direct evidence. He believed that the 12 miners themselves might have documented their discovery, leaving behind a record that could definitively expose the truth. He turned his attention to the personal effects that had been recovered from the skeletal remains in the sealed chamber. Each item, a worn wallet, a faded photograph, a dented lunch pail, was carefully examined, hoping for a clue, a hidden note, anything that might shed light on their final days. It was while meticulously going through a small, water-damaged leather pouch found near the remains believed to be those of Walter Jenkins that Franklin found it, a small, cloth-bound journal. The pages were brittle and stained, the ink faded in places, but the handwriting was still legible. Walter Jenkins, as it turned out, had been a thoughtful and observant man who had kept a detailed record of his life and his work. The early entries in the journal chronicled the daily routines of a coal miner in the 1970s, the camaraderie with his fellow workers, the dangers of the job, his hopes for his family. But as the journal progressed into the autumn of 1973, a shift in tone became apparent. Walter wrote of a growing unease within their crew, a sense that something was amiss in the deeper sections of the mine. He described their accidental discovery of a previously unknown network of tunnels, areas that were not marked on any of the official mine maps. In these hidden areas, they found evidence of large-scale, clandestine dumping, barrels with faded warning labels, strange chemical odors, and discolored soil that was clearly different from the surrounding coal and rock. Walter's entries revealed that the miners had quickly realized the potential danger and illegality of what they had stumbled upon. They discussed it amongst themselves, their entries filled with a mixture of fear and a strong sense of responsibility to their community. They knew that if these toxic materials leached into the groundwater, it could have devastating consequences for the town. The journal detailed their decision to document their findings. Walter wrote about taking photographs with a small, personal camera that he had secretly brought into the mine. He described hiding the film, fearing that their discovery had not gone unnoticed by the company. The entries, in the days leading up to their disappearance, were filled with a growing sense of paranoia and the fear that they were being watched. The final entry, abruptly cut short in mid-sentence and dated the very day they were reported missing, spoke of a special inspection being called by management in one of the older, supposedly inactive sections of the mine, the same section where the sealed chamber was located. Walter's last words conveyed a sense of foreboding, a feeling that this inspection was not what it seemed. As Franklin read the last entry, a wave of grief and anger washed over him. These men hadn't just been victims of a company's greed in covering up a historical injustice. They had been murdered to silence them about a contemporary crime that threatened the lives and well-being of the entire community. Their shared history as black miners in a racially charged town had likely fostered a strong sense of solidarity and a commitment to protecting their own. The journal provided the concrete evidence Franklin had been searching for. It confirmed Dr. Vance's theory about the illegal dumping and provided a clear motive for the miners' murder. It also revealed the courage and integrity of these 12 men, who had been willing to risk their lives to expose a dangerous secret. Franklin now understood the full scope of the conspiracy. The lie about the mine collapse in 1973 had served a dual purpose. It had not only buried the truth about the miners' deaths, but had also concealed the ongoing illegal activities within the mine. The powerful families who controlled the Bluebird mine had orchestrated a brutal and comprehensive cover-up to protect their wealth and their freedom. The journal was the key to unlocking the truth, a voice from the past that could finally bring justice to the 12 silenced men and expose the deep-seated corruption that had poisoned the town for generations. The fight was far from over, but now Franklin had a weapon, the truth, written in the hand of a man who had died trying to bring it to light. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time is it there. It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. While Sheriff Franklin Cole focused on the evidence contained within Walter Jenkins's journal, Dr. Judith Vance continued her relentless examination of the Bluebird mine's historical and financial records. She felt that there were still pieces of the puzzle missing, layers of deceit that had yet to be fully uncovered. Her research led her to dusty, overlooked documents detailing the mine's operational activities beyond coal extraction. She discovered sporadic references to storage fees and warehouse agreements with seemingly unrelated companies dating back to the late 1960s and early 1970s. These transactions appeared unusual for a coal mining operation, and the details were vague and deliberately obscured. Intrigued, Dr. Vance began to cross-reference these financial entries with local law enforcement records and reports of suspicious activities from that era. She uncovered a series of unsolved cases involving the transportation and disappearance of large quantities of counterfeit goods, primarily clothing, electronics, and even some pharmaceuticals. These incidents had occurred in the vicinity of the Bluebird mine, often involving unmarked trucks and clandestine nighttime movements. A disturbing picture began to emerge. Dr. Vance theorized that the Bluebird mine, with its network of underground tunnels and remote location, had been used as a storage facility for illegal goods. The warehouse agreements were likely a front for a highly profitable and highly illegal operation, one that the mine owners had managed to keep completely separate from their coal mining business. This revelation added another layer of complexity and danger to the investigation. The 12 miners of 1973 might not only have stumbled upon illegal toxic dumping, they could have also inadvertently discovered evidence of this extensive counterfeiting operation. The sealed chamber, already a burial site and a place to conceal historical evidence, could have also served as a secure, off-the-book storage area for illicit materials. The presence of the centuries-old chains in the chamber now took on yet another potential meaning. While they undoubtedly served as a link to the mine's history of slavery, they could have also been repurposed by the criminal enterprise in 1973. Perhaps they were used to secure the counterfeit goods, their antique appearance providing an unexpected layer of concealment within the hidden chamber. Dr. Vance's further research into the Bluebird mine's corporate history revealed a period of significant financial instability in the early 1970s. The illegal dumping operation, she theorized, could have been a desperate attempt to cut costs and avoid proper disposal regulations, a move that would have been highly profitable but also incredibly reckless and illegal. The motive for murder was now chillingly clear. The 12 miners, by uncovering the illegal dumping, had become a direct threat to the mine owners' financial well-being and their freedom. Sealing them in that hidden chamber wasn't just a way to dispose of inconvenient witnesses. It was a calculated act of desperation to protect a much larger criminal enterprise. Franklin realized that the resistance they were facing from the town's powerful families was not just about protecting a tarnished family name. It was about safeguarding a legacy of criminal activity and the vast wealth derived from it. The stakes were far higher than he had initially imagined. He and Dr. Vance were not just digging up the past. They were unearthing a present-day conspiracy with deep and dangerous roots. The truth was a powerful weapon, but it was also making them targets. The unraveling of the 1973 cover-up had exposed a network of lies and criminal behavior that those in power would stop at nothing to protect. The fight for justice was no longer just about the dead. It was a battle for the soul of the town itself. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The weight of this new information settled heavily on Franklin. The Bluebird mine was not just a tragic relic. It was the hub of a much larger, more sophisticated criminal enterprise. The corruption, as Dr. Vance had now proven, was not confined to a single, panicked act of murder in 1973. It was a long-standing generational business, conducted under the guise of an honest, hard-working industry. The families who ran the mine had not only leveraged their power and influence to cover up the deaths of the 12 miners, But they had also used the mine's remote and sprawling network of tunnels to hide and transport illicit goods, from counterfeit designer clothes to black market electronics. Dr. Vance's research revealed a key detail. The illicit operation had a specific point of entry and exit, a series of overlooked access tunnels far from the main entrance, known only to a select few. The illegal dumping of toxic waste was an entirely separate operation, a cost-saving measure that had tragically intersected with the miners' curiosity in 1973. It was a confluence of two different criminal enterprises that had led to the deaths of 12 men. This revelation gave Franklin a new and far more dangerous understanding of the hostility he was facing. The families weren't just protecting a historical reputation. They were protecting a criminal empire that was likely still in operation, albeit in a different form. The pressure, the threats, the vandalism, it wasn't just a reactionary cover-up. It was a coordinated effort by a criminal organization to protect its assets and its history of impunity. The stakes had been raised exponentially. Franklin and Judith held a private, late-night meeting with Reverend Johnson, sharing their discoveries. The Reverend listened with a quiet, grim resolve. "This confirms what the old-timers whispered about," he said, his voice low and heavy, with a truth that had finally been spoken. "They always said there was more than coal coming out of that mine, more than just hard work. They said the Harrison family built their wealth on a foundation of lies and shadows." The Reverend's insight was invaluable. He provided Franklin and Judith with key details about the social dynamics and family connections of the time, helping them understand the web of deceit and loyalty that had held the conspiracy together for decades. He spoke of the Harrison patriarch, a shrewd and ruthless man who had ruled the town and the mine with an iron fist. The men who had died, he explained, were not just miners. They were men of integrity, deeply connected to their community, and unafraid to speak truth to power. Their shared history as black miners in a racially segregated society had given them a powerful sense of unity, a brotherhood that had ultimately led them to challenge the corruption of the mine's owners. The three of them now had a clearer picture of the enemy. It wasn't a faceless corporate entity. It was a network of individuals bound by greed and a shared history of criminal activity. Their power was not supernatural, but very real, very human, and very dangerous. Franklin realized that the time for quiet investigation was over. To expose this conspiracy, they would need a decisive, bold move. The trail of evidence led back to the mine, the place where all the secrets were born and buried. They had to go back in, not to look at skeletons, but to find a final piece of evidence that could blow the entire conspiracy wide open. Franklin now understood why the miners had been sealed in that specific chamber. It wasn't just a convenient burial site. It was a way to neutralize the problem without having to involve anyone outside of their trusted inner circle. The illegal dumping and the counterfeiting operation were both secrets that had to be protected at all costs, and the 12 men had become a threat to both. Their deaths were a cold, calculated act of business, a brutal decision made to protect a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. The truth was not just a matter of historical injustice, but of contemporary criminal activity. The fight for justice was not against ghosts, but against a very real, very dangerous, and very corrupt enemy. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it there. It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The fragile calm of the investigation was shattered by a new wave of threats. This time, they were no longer anonymous or subtle. The powerful families, sensing that Franklin and his team were closing in on the full scope of their criminal past, escalated their tactics from intimidation to outright criminal attacks. They were no longer trying to protect their reputation. They were fighting for their freedom. The first act of aggression was a near-fatal one. While Franklin was at his home one evening, an unmarked car sped down his street, firing several shots into the side of his house. The bullets shattered a window and lodged in the wall just a few feet from where he was sitting. It was a clear, unambiguous message. They knew where he lived, and they were not afraid to use violence. Dr. Judith Vance, also came under direct attack. While she was packing her research materials from her hotel room, she was ambushed by two men in ski masks. They ransacked her room, destroying all of her notes and research, and left her with a clear warning: leave this town and forget what you've found. She was shaken but unharmed. Her resolve hardened by the clear and present danger. The attack confirmed what they had suspected. The criminal enterprise was still active and had a network of enforcers willing to commit violence to protect its secrets. Reverend Samuel Johnson also found himself a target. The church, a symbol of the community's resilience and a sanctuary for those who had suffered under the town's racial injustices, was set on fire. The fire was extinguished quickly by the volunteer fire department, but the message was clear. The criminals were willing to attack not just individuals, but the very institutions of the community that stood for truth and justice. The Reverend, heartbroken but not defeated, promised to rebuild, his resolve strengthened by the viciousness of the attack. Franklin realized that the siege was not a supernatural event, but a very human, very dangerous criminal conspiracy. The corruption of the Harrison family and their allies was not limited to the past. It was a living, breathing entity that had been allowed to fester and grow for generations. They were using every tool at their disposal: intimidation, violence, and even arson to protect their secrets. The silence that had once protected their ancestors had now become a battleground for a new generation of criminals. The time for cautious investigation was over. Franklin and his team were now targets in a war. They needed to go into hiding to protect themselves and to find a way to expose the conspiracy once and for all. They could no longer rely on official channels, as it was clear that the town's power structure was compromised. Their only option was to find the final piece of evidence, a piece of irrefutable proof that the miners had left behind, a piece that the criminals were still desperate to find. They moved to a secure, remote location, a small cabin in the deep woods owned by one of the Reverend's trusted parishioners. It was here, in the quiet of the forest, that they made their plan. The miner's journal had mentioned taking photographs, a crucial detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The journal had not mentioned what they had done with the camera or the developed film. Franklin and Judith theorized that the miners, knowing the danger, had hidden the evidence in the one place they knew no one would look: the mine itself. The sealed chamber had yielded skeletons and old chains, but it had not given up everything. Franklin believed that the miners, in their final desperate moments, had found a way to hide the film, a final act of courage to ensure their story was told. The criminals, in their haste to seal the chamber and cover their tracks, had likely overlooked it. Franklin, Judith, and Reverend Johnson, now a tight-knit and determined team, knew that their only chance for survival and justice was to go back to the source of the horror, back to the Bluebird mine, and find the truth that had been hidden for 50 years. The stakes were higher than ever. It was no longer just about justice for the dead. It was about survival for the living. The fight for justice was now a fight for their lives, and the final battle would be fought in the very place where the conspiracy was born. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. Under the cover of a moonless night, Sheriff Franklin Cole, Dr. Judith Vance, and Reverend Samuel Johnson made their way back to the Bluebird mine. The site was quiet, the heavy machinery now surrounded by a chain-link fence and a small private security patrolled Harrison family's last-ditch attempt to control access. But the mine had other entrances, lesser-known tunnels and ventilation shafts that had fallen into disuse over the decades, and the Reverend knew them all. Reverend Johnson, his knowledge of the mine's history and layout proving invaluable, led them to a small, overgrown entrance far from the main site. "My grandfather used this shaft to get to and from the Black Seam as a young man," he whispered, his breath a white plume in the cold night air. "The company forgot about it a long time ago. They think they've sealed every way in, but they've only sealed the ones they knew about." The descent into the mine was a harrowing experience. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The tunnels were dark and tight, a claustrophobic maze that seemed to close in on them with every step. Franklin, with his training and courage, led the way, his flashlight cutting a steady beam through the darkness. Judith, with her historian's memory and her knowledge of the mine's geological structure, served as their guide, helping them navigate the winding passages. Reverend Johnson, a man of faith and a living conduit to the mine's history, provided the spiritual and historical context, his quiet strength, a powerful presence in the oppressive darkness. They made their way to the sealed chamber, the site of the original crime. They were not here to mourn the dead. They were here to find a final piece of evidence that the miners had left behind. Franklin believed that the miners, in their final desperate moments, would have hidden the photographic evidence in a place that no one would think to look. The journal had mentioned taking photographs, a crucial detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The journal had not mentioned what they had done with the camera or the developed film. Franklin and Judith searched the chamber, their flashlights casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They meticulously combed every inch of the space, looking for a loose rock, a hidden cavity, a sign that the miners had left a message for the future. The search was slow and agonizing, their hearts pounding with the dual pressure of finding the evidence and the very real possibility of being discovered by the Harrison family's security. It was Judith who found it, tucked deep within a crevice in the chamber wall, a crevice that was hidden behind one of the rusted chains, was a small, sealed tin box. It was a lunch pail, the kind the miners had used to carry their food. It was carefully wrapped in a thick, waxy cloth, a makeshift waterproof covering that had preserved its contents for 50 years. Franklin, his hands shaking, opened the box. Inside, carefully wrapped in another layer of cloth, was a small, personal camera and a roll of developed film. The camera was a simple, manual model, its lens caked in 50 years of dust. The film, a small canister of negatives, was perfectly preserved. It was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the truth that the miners had died to protect. A sound, a low, shuffling noise from the tunnel behind them, sent a jolt of ice through all three of them. The Harrison family security patrol had found them. They had a physical, high-stakes confrontation. The horror of the story wasn't supernatural, but very human. The danger they were in was very real, very present, and very deadly. The final battle for justice was about to begin. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The low murmur of voices and the distant glow of flashlights grew louder in the tunnels behind them. Sheriff Franklin Cole acted instinctively, his police training kicking in. He shoved the tin box with the film into his jacket, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "They've found us," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Reverend, Judith, we need to move. Now." The confrontation was swift and violent. 3 armed men, their faces obscured by the shadows and the tactical gear they wore, emerged from the tunnel. They were not ordinary security guards. They were hardened criminals, mercenaries hired by the Harrison family to protect their secrets. The leader, a large man with a cold, ruthless expression, pointed his weapon directly at Franklin. "Sheriff Cole," he said, his voice a low growl, "I'm afraid you've stumbled upon something you shouldn't have. Hand over the box and nobody gets hurt." Franklin, his own weapon drawn, held his ground. "The truth is not for sale," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "This is a homicide investigation, and I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The standoff was a tense and terrifying battle of wills. Franklin knew he couldn't win a firefight against 3 armed men in the confined space of the tunnel. He had to use his wits, his knowledge of the mine, and his courage to outmaneuver them. He used the maze-like tunnels to his advantage, using his knowledge of the mine's layout to create diversions and traps. Judith, with her historian's memory and her knowledge of the mine's geological structure, helped him find safe passages, and the Reverend, a man who had walked these tunnels his whole life, guided them through the labyrinth of the past. The fight was brutal and physical. Franklin, a man of peace, was forced to use his training, his strength, and his determination to fight for his life. He managed to disarm one of the men, using the darkness and the claustrophobic confines of the tunnel to his advantage. Judith and the Reverend, their courage unwavering, fought alongside him, using the mine's environment to their advantage. They used rocks as projectiles, their knowledge of the old support beams to create diversions, and their sheer will to survive to outlast their attackers. The fight ended with the sound of a gunshot, a loud, final report that echoed in the tunnels. Franklin, using the old support beams of the tunnel, managed to bring down a portion of the ceiling, trapping the two remaining mercenaries. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. He had the evidence, but he was still deep within the mine, with no way to contact the outside world and a ticking clock on his life. He and his team, battered and bruised, made their way out of the mine through a long-forgotten ventilation shaft, the same one the Reverend had spoken of in his oral histories. The truth was now safe, but the final battle for justice was yet to be fought. They emerged from the mine into the cold light of dawn, the sun's first rays, a silent, powerful promise of a new day. They were free, but the fight for the miners' souls was just beginning. The true horror of the story was not in the darkness of the mine, but in the dark hearts of the people who had tried to bury the truth for 50 years. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The full light of dawn broke over the mountains as Sheriff Franklin Cole, Dr. Judith Vance, and Reverend Samuel Johnson emerged from the mine. The silence of the dawn was broken by the sound of sirens as Franklin, using a phone from a remote cabin, managed to call for backup. The story of the Bluebird Mine had finally come to light, and the world was about to hear it. The photographs from the tin box were irrefutable proof. They showed the 12 miners standing next to barrels of illegal toxic waste, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They also showed a series of crates hidden in a separate section of the mine, filled with counterfeit goods. The photos were a testament to the courage of the miners and a damning indictment of the Harrison family's criminal enterprise. The arrests were swift and decisive. Mayor Harrison and his accomplices were taken into custody, their criminal empire unraveled by the bravery of a sheriff and a small team of determined individuals. The town was rocked by the truth, its long-held secrets finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. The shock and disbelief of the town's citizens slowly gave way to a wave of outrage and a demand for justice. The Bluebird Mine, once a place of death and darkness, was now a monument to the resilience of the human spirit. The town, in a historic and emotional vote, decided to turn the mine into a memorial and a museum, a place where the full story of its history, the good and the bad, could be told. The families of the 12 miners finally had their closure. Their loved ones had not died in a meaningless accident. They had died fighting for what was right. Franklin Cole, a man who had once tried to escape the shadow of the mines, was now its guardian. He was no longer just the sheriff, he was a symbol of justice, a man who had challenged a long-standing system of corruption and oppression and had won. Dr. Judith Vance, a historian who had once only read about such stories, was now a central part of one, her expertise and courage proving that some truths are worth fighting for. And Reverend Samuel Johnson, the man who had kept the oral history alive, was now a living testament to the fact that the memory of the past, if kept alive, can change the future. The story of the Bluebird Mine was over. The corruption and the murder had been exposed. But the legacy of the 12 miners would live on, a powerful reminder that justice, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. It was a story of hope, a story of courage, and a story of a town that finally had the courage to face its past and embrace a future built on truth and justice. The long, dark night of the Bluebird Mine had finally given way to a new dawn.